Styled components can be very useful, but can we also use them for our div here, for example? The answer is absolutely. If we want a styled component, which we really only use in this file, we can also create it in that file. We can also create a brand new file as we did it for the button. But even though we're only using the button here in this app, you could argue that a button is a component you might be using in a lot of other places of the app as well. Now for the div, that might also be the case. Maybe you have other form inputs in other parts of the app as well. But to also show you that you can have multiple components per file, and that this might make sense if a component is really only getting used in that file, I will now create a brand new component in that course input file. Thus far, we always had one component per file, and that generally is a good rule to keep. But if you have a component that is really only getting used by that other component in that file, having both components in the same file can make sense too. So here I want to have my form control, for example. That name is ultimately up to you, but since I'll use it as a component in JSX, it should start with a capital character. And here again, I'll use the styled components package. So we can import styled from styled-components. And then here we can use styled, and in this case styled div, because I want to replace this div later. So I want to render a div. So if I go up, I have my styled div and now the backticks. And now in here, I want to have those styles. So we can grab all those form control styles here, copy them, and add them here between the backticks. Now, just as before, get rid of the selectors. Just have your styles in here, and if you have something like this, where you have the class that is on that div which you're creating here, and then you want to target a nested element, you do the same as we did in the button with the pseudo selectors. You simply use and this tells styled components, I'm now talking about labels inside of this div. So that and always refers back to that component which is being created. And if you then want to have nested selectors you want to target, that is how you do it. So we can do this here also for the input, of course, and also here if we have an input that is focused, and also here if we want to check whether we have invalid on this div, and also here. With that, we have our styled component, our form control, which is this styled div. And now we can go back here and now replace this div here with our form control. If we save that, it generally works. And you will see here on that div, we also have these strange unique classes. You will also see that these are of course different classes than we have on the button, because as I said, you have unique classes per component to ensure that styles never spill over. But you'll also see that if I submit this in an empty state, we don't get the error state here. Now of course this can't work because we're no longer setting the invalid class here. And we need that invalid class here in our rules though, here and here. Now the good thing is that these styled components, so the components returned by these styled components functions, forward all props you set on them to the underlying component, so to the underlying div here. So we can still add a class name here, and here the value we want to pass in is either an empty string or invalid. We no longer need to set form control because the styles that were attached by form control are now already getting attached with the setup we have up there. So instead we just need to set this to invalid or nothing. So what we can do here is we can simply check if not is valid, and if that's the case, I add invalid as a string here. And with this syntax, I otherwise add nothing, which is perfectly fine because I need no other class if it is valid. But if it is invalid, the invalid class is getting added. And now with that, we have the same behavior as before here if we add goals. That, however, is only one way of doing this. We can do this, and it's perfectly fine, but you can also utilize another feature provided by styled components. You can also add props to your styled components and utilize those props inside of these backticks, so inside of your styles, to easily change styles dynamically. How does this work? Let's say here on our form control, when we use it down there, we want to add an invalid prop. Name is up to you because it's your component. And this should be true or false. The value we feed in, therefore, is not isValid. So if isValid is true, we feed in false because it's not invalid if isValid is true. If isValid is false, we feed in true because invalid is true if isValid is not true. So we set invalid to true if what the user entered was invalid. And this invalid prop can now be used between those backticks here. Now, how do we use it? Well, we wanted to change the border color of the input, for example, right? So we go to the place where we set up the border color. And now here, since you're between backticks, you can use this $ curly brace syntax you already know. And here you pass in an arrow function, which receives props as a parameter, and then should return the text that should be returned in this exact position. This function will be called by the styled components package, and for props, it will feed in all the props your component gets. So in this case, the invalid prop. So here we can now check if invalid is true, and if this is the case, we return red as a text, otherwise we stick to this grayish color. And this should of course be props.invalid. So with that, we're having this dynamic way of changing parts of the styles based on some props that are passed to our styled component. So this is this. Now we also want to set the background color. So I'll set background here to a dynamic value. And just as before, I check props invalid. And if it is invalid, I set this background to this light reddish color here we picked earlier. And otherwise, I'll set it to transparent. And with that, we can remove this style here. Now we can also already remove the label style, which was based on the existence of the invalid class, which we no longer add, and instead go up to that label styling here and add a color definition. And just as before, the value we set for color is dynamic. We provide this function which will be called by the styled components package, and we check if the invalid prop is true. If it is, we set a color of red, otherwise a color of black. And with this approach, if I save this, we got the exact same behavior as before, as you see. But now, by utilizing styled components only, and by utilizing this feature of dynamically changing parts of the styles based on the props that are set on your styled component. This sometimes can be hard to get into, this way of thinking, but it's also a pretty nice way of working with components and styles. Therefore, I wanted to show this to you. Now there's one last brief use case which I want to cover before I show you a more CSS-ish alternative. Now there's one last thing I want to cover when we talk about styling, and that would be media queries. Media queries, of course, often are important to get the right look. At the moment, if we preview this in a mobile device here, let's say the Pixel 2, doesn't matter which one you use, this is how it looks like. Let me zoom in a bit. This is how it looks like, and that's definitely all right. Right? Of course, you might want to add more to make this look good on mobile, but from a pure styling perspective, that looks good. Nothing is going beyond the edges, so that looks okay. But maybe we want to make sure that this button actually spans the entire width if we're on a small device, and only takes the space it needs if we're not on a mobile device. And that would be a scenario where we might want to use a media query. So let's go back to the button, and how can we now add a media query here when we're using styled components? It's actually super simple. You just add your media query here, add media, and define your criteria, for example, min width 768 pixels. And now you just put the styles into that media query that should affect this element when that condition here is met. That's all. You need no selector in there, nothing else, just the styles that should be applied to this component if this condition here for this media query is met. So here, that is actually now the media query for big devices, non-mobile devices, and there I want to set the width to auto. The default width, so if the media query is not met, can be set to 100% then up there. And as a result, if we save this, we have that big button here on mobile. But if I go to a bigger screen here, by zooming out a bit, you see now the button only takes as much space as it needs. And keep in mind, I'm zoomed in here so that you can see things a bit better, which is why for me I have to drag quite a bit to go to this big screen mode. But this is now a media query in action, and it's in action with the help of styled components. So styled components, definitely a nice package for, well, styling components and ensuring that components really only affect the styles on which you set them up. Now, whether you like styled components or not is an absolutely personal thing. There is no wrong or right here. Now, when it comes to me, personally, I prefer CSS in CSS files. I like the separation of CSS and JavaScript. I like having clean JavaScript files, and I simply like default CSS. Now, of course, you can absolutely stick to the CSS approach we used at the beginning, where you had global, non-scoped styles, and you as a developer had to make sure you're not accidentally reusing names, class names, you're not accidentally affecting the styles of other components. That is definitely one route you can take. You can also, however, take CSS to the next level with a feature called CSS modules. CSS modules is a feature which is only available in projects that are configured to support it, because it needs a code transformation that needs to be done before your code runs in the browser. Now, the good thing is the React projects created with Create React App, which we used, are already configured to support CSS modules. This is actually an excerpt from the official Create React App docs, where you learn how you can utilize CSS modules. And it's super simple to utilize CSS modules. So let me show you how it works. And let's start with the good old button again. Now, of course, you can stick to the styled component there, but I will comment this out and comment out this import, and instead add the import of React from React again, because I will comment in my own component again, this one, which uses JSX and which therefore needs the React import. Now we have the button CSS file, and in there we got the different styles, and we can leave that as it is. There's one thing we now need to change though. Of course, we need to add the import to the CSS file again, but instead of importing it like this, you now import it slightly different. You import classes or styles, totally up to you, from the CSS file. That's a syntax we haven't used before, but that is actually how you have to import from a CSS file if you want to use CSS modules. Actually, for that code transformation, which is needed behind the scenes, to happen, you also need to rename your file a little bit, your CSS file. You need to add .module in there so that it's named button.module.css. And then, of course, here you import from button.module.css. This is basically a signal to the underlying compilation process to transform the code so that CSS modules work. And I'll show you how they work behind the scenes in a second. So now we have this import, and now we need to do something with this imported styles thing here. We use it down there where we apply our class name. Instead of applying a string class name like this, you apply something dynamic. You refer to that styles thing, which you're importing from the CSS file, and that thing turns out to be an object. And in that object, you'll have every class you defined in your file as a property. So if I added a button class here in the CSS file, I now have the button property here. And that's all we need to do. This will apply this button class in a special way to this button element here. Let's see it in action. Let's save this and go back to our application. And we see The button looks the way it looked before. Now we see something interesting if we inspect this here in the DevTools. On the button, you see a very strange class. This is not the same class as added by styled components. Those classes looked like this here on the div. Instead, this looks a bit like the class we defined, button, but with more information added to it. It's basically component name underscore our class name in the CSS file, double underscore some unique hash. What CSS modules does, or what this concept of CSS modules does, what the build process does under the hood, is it takes those CSS classes in the CSS file and basically changes those class names to be unique. That's the core thing it does. For every component, it changes the class names of the classes you're importing here, so of the CSS file you're importing, to be unique. So if you import from the CSS file here in the button component, it will create unique classes, unique versions of all those styles and classes here for this component. And for that, it generates brand new class names that look like this. Inside of these class names, your styles will be. So it will just keep your styles. It will not touch those, but wrapped into this new class name. You can see this if you expand the head section here in the rendered DOM. There you will see a bunch of style tags. And if we now search for the one here it is for the button, we see that's this newly generated class name. Here we have our button styles, and that newly generated class name is also used on the focus style, on the hover, and on the active style. And with that, this CSS modules concept ensures that the CSS styles we set up in a CSS file are scoped to the component we import this file into. For that, we need to work with CSS classes here, because we then access those classes as properties on the imported styles object. This is how we basically make the connection between these dynamically generated class names, which we as a developer don't know in advance, and our components here. And that's also what you see here in the official docs. That's in the end all that's to it. This is how you can use CSS modules. And for me, that's actually the best of both worlds. We have our styles set up in CSS files, but they're still scoped to the components where we use them. So in the next module, let's also port the course input back to use the CSS file. And then I will also show you how to use media queries with CSS modules. So now that we use CSS modules, let's also use the concept here in the course input component. We got the course input CSS file, and as you learned, you need to change the name to .module.css. With that, I mean the file name. So course input.module.css. In the course input component, you then import from course input.module, and as you learned, you import something from there. Again, the name is totally up to you. Typically, you name it styles or classes or anything like that. We can remove the styled import from styled components because I'm going to comment out this form control. Like this. I'm not going to use it anymore. Instead, down there, I'll go back to my good old div. And on that div, I will add class name to styles.form control. And now we have a problem. This is an invalid property name, but I named my class form control in here. Well, it's not a problem. We just have to use a different syntax for accessing the property. We use the square brackets and wrap this name into single quotes. This is how we can also access properties in JavaScript, and with that we can also access properties with such a name. Because strings are valid keys in JavaScript objects. Alternatively, of course, you pick different CSS class names without dashes in them. Here, however, I'll stick to that, and there for now we got our styling back. Now, of course, the invalid style is not getting applied. And the reason for that is simple. For that invalid style to be applied, we need to make sure that the invalid CSS class is added on the element. And currently, that's never happening. We're only adding form control, only adding this class, or the transformed CSS modules version of that class, to be precise. We're never adding the transformed invalid class version. It is something we can also do easily though. We can go back to that backtick syntax to create a string where we inject values. And the first value I want to inject is that resolved class name here. So I inject this converted class name, which we're in the end extracting from that styles object, here into this string. With that, if we save this, nothing should change. And now, of course, just as before, we can add an additional class here. We can check if not is valid, and if that's the case, I add styles.invalid here, referring to that converted version of that invalid class. Converted because that's what the CSS module process will do behind the scenes. And invalid because the CSS class name is invalid in here. So with that, we're adding this converted version of our own class, this scoped version of this CSS styling, so to say, to this div if is valid is false. If we now save this and we go back, if I click add goal, it's red. If I type, it's no longer red. It gets red again, and so on. So this now works again, but now we're adding dynamic classes here with CSS modules. It's not really that different from normal classes, because these are normal classes. We just extract the converted class names as they were generated by CSS modules. That's all. And then we combine them as needed. Last but not least, let's see how media queries are set up in CSS modules. And for that, let's go back to the button. There, I had a media query in my styled components. So we can copy that and go to the CSS file which we're using now. And here, you just add a media query as you would always add it. Maybe here at the bottom. Let me get rid of these slashes. The important difference to styled components, of course, is that now you need your selector again. You always need that in CSS. The non-selector syntax here in styled components is really just a styled components feature because it processes your CSS code. This is not CSS code that would work like this in a browser because CSS always needs a selector, and that's why we need to add a selector here. With that, however, we got everything we need. We set the width here to 100% on small devices, and then on bigger screens, we reset it to auto. And that should be all that's needed. No other changes are required because I'm working on the same CSS class, which I'm already adding to the component here. So with that, you see I have the big button there, and on bigger screens, it's the smaller one. So that also works, and it also works with CSS modules. Now, ultimately, it's absolutely up to you which approach you prefer. I showed you the CSS only, the styled components, and the CSS modules approach, and I mentioned the different pros and cons. And you can simply use the approach you like. For the rest of this course, I will use CSS modules because I like that scoping and I like having my CSS code and my JavaScript code separated. But if you prefer a different approach, that's of course also perfectly fine.